Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. In this section, we are going to be talking about virtue ethics, and the beginner, the one that really started most of this and began penning it and putting it together in a most significant way is going to be Aristotle. So it does reach back, and it does start all the way back with the ancient Greek thinkers, and Aristotle is going to be the one who does the most work and really gives it to us in the format that we are going to be looking at and studying here in this introduction class. And so as we look at something like a virtue ethics, what we're going to find immediately is that where the other moral theories, where the other ethical engines are really interested in activities, what should I do, which really is the definition of ethics, right? Ethics, that's the study of what we ought to do. Instead of asking the question, what ought we to do, virtue ethics asks the question, what sort of person should I be? What sort of person should I be? So not what should I do, but who should I be, or what should I become, really is going to be more of the focus of virtue ethics. Now, if you look at the other moral theories, even the ones that we haven't talked about, we only talked about two in this class, and there are multiple others that I address when I teach ethics classes, but in all of those, they really do focus on what we ought to do, like action, but they don't really look inside to figure out who you should be. And I think that's a very important aspect of morality, is looking at yourself and trying to decide what kind of person do I want to be, what kind of person do I want to become. None of the other ethical theories really address this. They address activity, but they don't address the individual. They will address things like maximizing happiness or how we should treat others with respect. They talk about adhering to rules. They talk about honoring absolute rules. But I think we're missing something that's very, very important there when we do that. And to kind of illustrate what I mean when I say I think we're missing something important, imagine that you've got a police officer who he does the right things, and he obeys the laws, and he fulfills his duty as a police officer, but not because he wants to, and in fact he would violate the laws and he would abuse his position, but he doesn't because he's afraid he'll get caught, not because morally he wants to obey the rules, he wants to be honest, or he wants to, I'm going to say, serve and protect, as the motto is, not because of those things, but because he's afraid he'll get caught and he doesn't want to suffer the consequences of having gotten caught. Would we say that that individual was morally just? Isn't there something missing from a person who, they're not doing anything wrong, but they would if they could, if they weren't afraid, perhaps, of getting caught? Isn't there something perhaps missing there, something that we would want in our police officers, that they're doing it more out of not just duty, like Kant would say, or not even more to bring the greatest amount of pleasure to the greatest number of persons, perhaps, but simply because they want to be a certain kind of person and they want to be a certain kind of police officer? Isn't there something that's just missing if that's all there is to it? It does seem that there is something missing, and that we would want a little bit more from those individuals than just that they're doing their job because it's their job, or they're following the rules, or they don't want to get caught. Maybe there's more to it than that, than just those aspects. And in fact, if we wonder if there's more to it, think of it for just a moment. If you're raising your child and you've got this desire that your child be a moral individual, don't you think that there's more to it than just, hey, my kid obeys the rules? And rather, aren't you trying to focus on the aspect of, hey, and this is the kind of person I want my child to become? And that's really the difference. Not just what does my child do, but who is my child? And so Aristotle is going to focus more on that aspect of thinking, where this is what they are, more than just these are these are the things that they do or don't do, and that moral duty goes much, much further beyond just the outward activity, but it has something to do with the inside of us as well. What if we began by considering what is it that makes a human, what makes a desirable human life, not just a desirable human, but think about it for just a minute, because I said in one of the earlier lectures that I was going to talk eventually about what does it mean to have a good life. What does it mean for a person to have a desirable life or a good life? A life that when you die, when you're laying there on your deathbed and you're about to die, that you would want to have done it again. You'd say, yeah, I'd do it the same way. Or what is it that makes a good life? That life that flourishes. What is it that makes that kind of good life? So that you would want that your children have that same kind of life that you did. And so what Aristotle says here is that we should begin a moral theory by trying to figure out what kind of life would be a good life. And then, since we have this understanding of here's a good life, here's what we would want for ourselves, or here's what we would want for our children, and then since these are the things we would want, now we can move forward in thinking about how we ought to behave. Because if that good life is the thing that we're shooting for, if that's the thing that we're looking towards, then we can base our actions on the fact of, and they will lead us to this good life. So with virtue ethics, it's important to understand that it's not a single theory, but really it's rather a family of theories. Yeah, we can trace it back to Aristotle, but there are going to be other people and other ideas that kind of come in here as well. But one of the strengths of virtue ethics is that since it is a family, it's not as linear, and it's not as contained. You can't just have you're not just shooting for this one thing, and so it can be a little bit more broad in its thinking. So with utilitarianism, you get caught up in consequences, and with deontology, you get caught up in following your duty. Virtue ethics will take both of those things and incorporate them together and say it's a matter of incorporating these two things and this over here and this over here and this over here. So it's less limited, and it's more thinking in a cloud and less thinking in a line. And so you can kind of encompass a greater amount of situations and a greater amount of details and a greater amount of thinking than you can in some of these others, a little more limited way of approaching morality. And so it tries to be, I'd say, kind of more all-encompassing. So one of the standards for right and wrong, one of the standard kind of ideas that Aristotle gives to us is he says that an act is morally right just because it is one that a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. So what makes something morally right or wrong? One of the things that Aristotle wants us to do is he wants to look for a virtuous person, and he wants us to emulate them. And so if you're trying to figure out if something is right or wrong, find somebody who is virtuous and try to behave like them if they're behaving within character. Now, Aristotle understands that not everyone who's virtuous necessarily behaves virtuous all the time. So you can't just find a virtuous person and just behave the way they do, because sometimes they'll act out of character. Somebody who's usually really, really slow-tempered or even-tempered can, in fact, lose their temper. That does happen. And so he says that morality, part of a moral act, is one where you see a virtuous person, and as long as they're acting in character, you see what they would do, and then you behave accordingly. And so that's the idea. Look for that moral person and try to emulate what they do. Look for that moral person and try to act the way they do. So, according to virtue ethicists, action is not right because it's based on the results, right? So it's not like utilitarianism. It's not consequence-based. It's also not based on a hard and fast rule, so something like deontology. Rather, things are right because they would be done by someone who is truly a virtuous person. This person is then a role model or a moral exemplar. They're a moral example. They would provide a goal for the rest of us to shoot for, even though each of us will fall short at some point, right? And so this is what they would do, so that's what we would do. Now, even at the risk of kind of a oversimplified, overused idea or saying, right? In a sense, part of what he's doing here is like, what would a virtuous person do? And so I'm just going to use the kind of colloquial, what would Jesus do, right? If Jesus is that moral person, that moral example, kind of what would Jesus do in this situation? And then you have to do kind of what he would do if you're going to be a virtuous person. So what would a virtuous person do? And then that's how you should behave as well. That's how you can find and train yourself into being a virtuous individual. Now, within virtue ethics, virtue ethicists understand that sometimes rules are necessary because a moral role model might not be sufficient. And so you might look for that virtuous person, but perhaps you're in a situation where you haven't found a virtuous person, or a situation comes up where you don't know what this virtuous individual might do. And so what do? Well, there are sometimes rules that you can use as well. And so virtue ethics is more flexible than the other two that we've studied so far, in that you can use both. You can use the virtuous example over here, and you can use the rule over here, and you can just bring them together if you need to. You can make them merge together if you need to. So you can use one of them or the other independently, but you can also bring them together and use them cohesively as well. And so you might follow a rule. The rule might be something like do what is honest, or act loyally, display courage, deal justly with others, show wisdom, be temperate, avoid gluttony, reform from infidelity, don't be timid, lazy, stingy, or careless, and free yourself from prejudice, and so on. These are all rules. We don't have to necessarily find the virtuous person who's displaying them. If we know the rule, we can follow the rule. It's a virtuous rule, and so good. Now, remember, within utilitarianism, that second weakness of utilitarianism is what do you do when rules conflict? So what do you do when rules conflict within virtue ethics? Well, what do? Well, you look for a virtuous person and you follow their lead. What would they do when the rule of, don't be careless versus don't be lazy, when they come into conflict? I'm not sure how they could. I just picked two off the list. So you've got these two. If these two come into conflict with each other, how do you resolve that particular conflict? Well, you turn and you look for somebody who's virtuous and you try to see how they're going to behave within that conflict, and then you follow their example. True, there will inevitably be disagreement about who counts as a virtuous person. So for me, a virtuous person might be someone like, I'm just going to say my father, who I think is a pretty virtuous individual. If he's a virtuous individual, another person might look at him and say he's not a virtuous person. And so how do you know when you've got a virtuous person in front of you and when you don't? Because there are going to be disagreements. In fact, some people might idolize Hitler as being a very virtuous person, or even a Stalin or a Pol Pot or whoever you pick. Maybe there's someone who thinks that these individuals display virtue when in fact, other people say they don't display virtue. Isn't there that kind of conflict? And what do you do when rules conflict? And what do you do when that virtuous characters, when two different individuals might display two different kinds of actions? Who do you follow? Who do you follow as being the one who is in fact behaving virtuously in this circumstance? In this case, it doesn't really have to cripple us. In virtue ethics, what they say is that that's part of the discussion. Part of finding, discovering, and becoming a virtuous person is seeing these conflicts and working through them so that on the other end of these types of decisions, you will have a greater amount of wisdom and knowledge and understanding and experience, and you'll become more of a virtuous person through those experiences as well. So it doesn't necessarily stop the argument because there's a conflict in rules. That doesn't end. That doesn't mean that there's no discussion. It's one of the great strengths of virtue ethics is that kind of room for disagreement and discussion are always there. And so one of that, again, part of the strength of virtue ethics is it accepts the fact that morality is very, very complicated, that it's not simple, that you can't just have that, again, deontology or utilitarianism and it just solves the problem. Instead, they say it's vastly complex and that humans are not simple. We're not waffles. If you remember in the last lecture, we are plates of spaghetti, And so having something that simply tries to answer all questions when it comes to morality, they're going to say just won't work, because humans and virtue are very, very complicated. And so imagine that you're trying to take morality and make it as simple and put it into a textbook like you can put the rules of mathematics into a textbook. You can't do that with morality. It's too complicated, and there's too much happening to make it just that simple, say, virtue ethicist. And so there's more to it than just that kind of mathematical, precise, you can ignore this or ignore that. Morality seems to be a different kind of discipline than, say, math. And so you have to treat it differently, because different things are going to be required. And so, in fact, if it were just a simple case of, here are the moral facts of the matter, here's the moral, 2 + 2 = 4 of the matter, if it was that simple, or if it was that systematic is a better word, because math is also very complicated, but math is still systematic. So with morality, the virtue ethicists say, it's not just that systematic. It's so complicated that this system over here breaks down, and this system over here breaks down. And so what do? There are multiple systems, and how do you try to take those systems and fit them together in such a way so that you can get something that even appears to be like a virtuous approach or person or system? If it were really as simple as memorizing facts about morality, like the utilitarian and the deontologist said, then we could find a child prodigy who was tremendously gifted at memorizing things. And we have these children who can just memorize facts and memorize them almost in a computer database type way. They just get them so fast, and they keep them, right? They retain them. Certainly not me. But if morality was simply a matter of memorizing facts of the case, those child prodigies who do in fact memorize things so quickly and so easily, they would be some of the morally most competent, not meaning that they behaved accordingly, but they would be some of the morally most knowledgeable individuals in our culture. And in fact, we don't see that. And when you think about a child and you think about morality, in a sense, a lot of times we don't let kids decide the moral standards or the moral rights and wrongs for us and for our culture, because they're lacking something. And so even a child prodigy who can memorize facts of the matter very easily and quickly and accurately is not necessarily going to be someone that we would allow to be a moral voice that has a great amount of authority, because there's more than facts. And in fact, that's what the virtue ethicists are going to say, is that that ethics require wisdom. It requires wisdom, and this is probably the key element to virtue ethics, like duty was to deontology, or like pleasure and pain were to utilitarianism. Wisdom is going to be kind of that thing for virtue ethics, because the virtue ethicists and Aristotle are going to just emphasize over and over that it takes a kind of wisdom to understand all of the complicated situations, all the individuals who are involved, all of the different environments, all the different things that affect whatever situation it is that you're trying to decide about a moral and I ought or ought not do ... right? All of these different things are going to come into play, and it takes a very wise person to be able to take those things and scoop them all up and put them into that engine, all the relevant pieces, and then try to figure out on the backside what really is morally the right thing to do. And so wisdom is going to be a huge aspect of virtue, of ethics in the virtue ethicist's perspective. So imagine back to that child, turning to that child. If morality is nothing more than just facts of the matter, imagine turning back to that child and trying to get advice about dealing with a difficult coworker. Are you really going to do that? Are you going to turn to a child prodigy who can memorize facts really, really easily for advice on dealing with a difficult coworker? That seems more like something on the realm of wisdom, someplace where we'd want a person to have experience, knowledge, understanding, where they can bring all these things in together. What about if you're trying to counsel, say, a friend who's got a drug addiction, or who's trying to recover from like breaking up some type of relationship that's been broken up? Are you going to turn to that child, or are you going to turn to somebody who's got more experience and a broader understanding because of, perhaps the time that they've spent on this earth? There is, after all, a reason why the wise ones in villages and in towns, you turn to the older folks. Why? Because they've seen and done more. They just have. And so you turn to them because hopefully they've got some wisdom, simply because they've been around it and seen and done more. And because they've successfully seen and done more. They're still here. And so we turn to those individuals with more experience. And a child just hasn't had time. They haven't had time to figure those types of things out. So it's not a matter of being smart. It's not a matter of having a high IQ or having read a lot of books, but there has to be a certain amount of wisdom that comes with it. So with this kind of moral understanding, we need experience, we need emotional maturity, a great deal of reflection, and Aristotle is also going to be really, really high on training, that you train individuals to be virtuous persons. So you train them, you teach them, you take a child and you start them out at a young age, and you hopefully build them into the type of moral individual that you can be proud of when they become an adult and even longer. So we have to know how. Part of moral wisdom is that we need to know how to read people. We need to be familiar with all sorts of troubles that people can fall into, and we need to understand the different kind of personality issues that can prevent us from flourishing. We need to have a keen ability to pick up on social cues, and those, they say, are the sorts of things that you can't learn from books. Now, you can learn about social cues from books, or you can learn about personalities from books. But what they're saying here is that when you're confronted with a certain moral situation, you want a person who can read all of the individuals, who understands the situations and the difficulties that people can fall into, and that they have the ability to pick up on things, perhaps like little cues that even other people sometimes miss. So that wise person, that virtuous person, pick up on all these things and then somehow figure out what should or shouldn't be done. So they know a virtuous person is that individual who can take the logical aspect of humanity and the emotional aspect of humanity, and they know how and when to bring them together. And I don't know how many times I've said now, I think humans are both, right? So I'm not going to go through it again. But that wise person is the one who can figure out how to blend them. So when you're trying to blend these, a wise person is one who can take an emotion, like fear, for example, and they can understand that fear, while it can be a negative, it can also be a positive, because fear can be a signal of danger, and that can be a good thing. Now, you can let your fear cripple you, and that can be a bad thing, but in virtue ethics, that wise person is the one who can know the difference, who can tell when fear is a positive thing and when it's a bad thing. And so fear is not always bad. Sometimes it triggers something and it says, hey, pay attention to this, because there's a real sense of danger that can that fear can give to you, and that can be a positive thing. A wise person is someone who can know and understand when guilt is revealing moral faults. And so if you feel guilty about having done something, maybe you should pay attention to that feeling of guilt, because that means you did something wrong. You were wrong when you did ... And a wise person is someone who can tell the difference. Sometimes people feel guilty, and they shouldn't, because they didn't do anything wrong. I think often of an adult, of a parent rather, of a parent who is somehow disciplines their child, and they begin to feel guilty for what they've done. And a wise person is someone who comes along and has the ability to say, no, you were right in what you did. Maybe you feel bad because you hurt your child, but it was a good thing you did this, that you hurt your child in this way, right? Also, the wise person might be able to come along and say, no, you over hurt your child, right? And so there's that tricky kind of fine line where the wise person comes in and is able to tell us the difference. And so the emotions of fear and guilt and compassion. Compassion helps us know when we should help, that people do need help. But an over-compassionate person, the wise person, can come in and say, no, you're showing too much compassion, and you need to be a little tougher, more tough love or something like that. So that's what virtue ethics kind of is and what it can offer to us when it comes to finding morally right and wrong situations. We're looking for that wise person who can help others, who can themselves distinguish with their using both their intellect and their emotions, and then they can help others to do it as well. So in this case, what we see from virtue ethicists is that moral wisdom is an extremely complicated skill. Now, I like that word skill, and it's one that I think is particularly important here, because a skill is something that you take and you develop. Now, some people are better at developing skills more quickly than others. I really wanted to be an NBA basketball star, and I was really close. I mean, I was really close to nothing, no college experience, no nothing when it comes to basketball. Some people have a knack for picking up a skill of basketball faster and in a much more advanced way than others. When it comes to moral reasoning, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Some people have more of a skill. They're better at it. They can pick it up faster because it really is a skill. But like a skill, a basketball player who doesn't hone their skill, who doesn't work on it and constantly try to improve, the same thing's going to be true for moral wisdom. It's a skill that has to be developed. And wouldn't you know it, no NBA player became an NBA player, within a month or two. It takes time, and it takes that practice and that application of tremendous skill. And so it is something that you hone, and the more you practice and the more you hone, the better at it you become. So it's a skill. It does require knowledge, just like basketball requires knowledge. In this case, moral wisdom, is a skill that requires knowledge of the way the world works, but it also demands more than that. We must have a great deal of emotional intelligence as well. The moral virtues, which all require moral wisdom, therefore also require a combination of intellectual and emotional maturity. A person with only a crude appreciation of life's complexities or a blank emotional life is bound to be morally blind. Now, I think that's important. So a person who doesn't understand how complex life can be, they can be morally blind. And I'm thinking mostly here of children, although not only of children. But some people seem to think that life really is just kind of simple, that it's black and white. And I used to think that way too. I used to think life was pretty basic. Things were right, things were wrong. But the longer I walked around in the world, the more I came to realize that it's actually very, very complicated, and that things are often not simple, that they're often less simple than they are complicated. And some individuals don't really have an emotional life. These are those individuals who are perhaps really, really stoic or closed off from their emotional life, and they tend not to understand that what they are doing is morally blinding them. And so maybe they are really, really, say, logical thinkers or mathematically inclined. And so they think really not just black and white, but they think in kind of a cold, calculating aspect. So I think a really good example here is I think what Star Trek wanted to do, what it wanted to portray. I'm not sure it always did. I'm not sure the characters always stuck exactly to the characters that they were trying to portray. But the three main characters in the original Star Trek are Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy. And if you take a look at those three characters, what you're going to find is that Hollywood understands human nature. And so when they're putting together a show like that, they're going to make it about humans in human situations, because that's what we're interested in. We're kind of speciesistic in this way. that we're really interested in ourselves, not just us as individuals, but humans, and how we behave and how we got here and why we do what we do. So within that, what they did is they took both components of humanity, the logical aspect and the emotional aspect, and they put those two kind of at odds with each other, with Mr. Spock being the logical and with Dr. McCoy being the really emotional. So with Spock, it's pretty obvious. Most people know Spock's that kind of intellectual, no emotions. He keeps himself shut off from his emotional side, and he just thinks in logical terms. And then with McCoy, you see him emoting all the time. Well, I can't believe, Spock, you green-blooded, whatever. And so, he's constantly emotionally outraged at Spock, and he constantly has these emotional outbursts. And so what we're seeing there in Hollywood is that they take these two aspects of humanity, the intellect and the emotion, and they put them kind of on both shoulders of Captain Kirk. So it's kind of like that, the the good angel and the bad angel sitting on your shoulder, and the two of them are fighting with you. If you've seen in the cartoon strips, those two characters, the angel and the demon, that are fighting with each other about you, that are fighting within you, and saying you should go this way, you should go that way, right? And so you kind of see these two things here happening with Captain Kirk, and so he'll listen to Mr. Spock and that logic, and Kirk will listen to McCoy and the emotions, and then often, not always, but often, Kirk finds some kind of middle ground that is the right way to behave. We shouldn't behave purely logically. We shouldn't behave purely emotionally. There's this kind of middle ground here where both of them track, and that's the right outcome, right? And so part of virtue ethics is understanding that we're trying to find that blend with the intellectual and emotionally mature individual, pulling them together. That's kind of what the virtue ethicists are after. It is going to be true that some people are going to be by nature more kind and more generous than others. That's just kind of the way it works. There are also individuals who are going to be more quickly and easily come to wisdom and understanding the appropriate actions given whatever the circumstances might be. Both of those aspects are true within humanity. I know some individuals who are by nature just more generous than others, and others who who can show more of the ability to think through different situations. Not everybody's going to start in an equal place. Aristotle recognizes this, and he says that what we should do is train. There is a certain amount of training. Virtue, he says, is not inborn, but that it's something that takes a tremendous amount of time to acquire, just like playing basketball is not necessarily inborn. You have to train them. You can't take a person, no matter how great of an athlete they are, and then just throw them on a basketball court and expect them to be great. Now, some of them will obviously be greater than others because of their athletic abilities, but you can't just expect them to land on a court, tomorrow and compete in the NBA and win a championship, even if they're the greatest athlete that humanity's ever seen, because there are certain aspects of it that are skillful and they require time. The same thing the virtue ethicists are going to say. You've got to have some inborn ability, and you have to have parents or teachers who are training you in order to get you to do these things as well. So it's both. Some of it is a matter of moral luck, in the sense of that you've got to be lucky enough to be one of these people who has the ability to be virtuous, because some people are going to be by nature more virtuous than others. On the other hand, it's not just your nature, but there's a matter of moral luck as well, where if you've got a certain set of parents that are teaching you and they understand virtue, then you're going to be better equipped and better trained. I think of myself as being particularly fortunate with my parents. I think that they are virtuous individuals, and I think that they have trained all three of us to be virtuous individuals as well. Not that we all always do what we're supposed to do, but the training is there. And so we have been taught, and it's been something that they wanted, it's a skill they wanted for us to have developed. And so not everybody has that in their parents. A lot of my students talk about their parents, and it's like, my parent is the exact opposite of everything that I should be. And so not everybody has that, right? So it's kind of a matter of moral luck. Aristotle understands that there's an aspect of that in there as well. So as a child matures, hopefully through experience and through guidance, they're going to eventually begin to part of moral wisdom is not that you just take your parents' word for it. It's not that you are just a robot who takes the instructions, who takes the codes that are given to you, and you do what you're told. Now, as a child, perhaps that's what we do or what we should do, but Aristotle says later on what you want with moral wisdom is you want an individual who can take the rules and figure out how to apply them and win, and how to ignore the rules and rather do something else instead. So be honest is a good rule of thumb. On the other hand, aren't there times that we don't want people to be perfectly honest? Now Aristotle's going to say that that's the case, because it's a good rule of thumb, but being wise, part of being wise is understanding when we don't necessarily want our children to be totally honest. And so recently I heard a story about an individual who, the mother was trying to convince them as a child to be honest, and so a certain scenario came out and the child lied, and the parents said, and here's all the bad stuff that happens when you lie, and so don't lie, be honest. The child said, so I should be honest. Yes. The child then turned loose, to begin to enjoy life, because they understand this basic precept: you should be honest. 10 seconds later the phone rings, and it's someone that the mother doesn't want to talk to. So what does the mother say? Tell them I'm not here. Well, now the child is vastly confused, right? You're supposed to be honest. You just said be honest, and now you're not being honest. So when does the rule apply and when does the rule not apply? And that's part of the training, and that's part of the the moral sophistication of trying to become someone who understands morality. So even then, within virtue ethics, though, Aristotle understands that not everyone is as capable when it comes to reasoning within morality. And so Aristotle's going to say there is a time to understand when you've got a novice, like a virtue novice, someone who doesn't really know a lot, like a child. You don't want to over-explain to the child. How could you possibly communicate with this child when it is appropriate to lie? You can't cover all scenarios. That's not something you can do. So Aristotle says that sometimes you can't make it overly complicated, because for some people it'll get too complicated. They won't be able to follow you. And so you have to have sometimes just these kind of hard and fast, easy rules. And so here, this individual do ... right, for the novice. On the other hand, virtue ethics and Aristotle understand that you need to be able to be really, really complicated for other individuals or other thinkers who are much more capable. And so with virtue ethics, it's trying to make it so that you can approach each individual appropriately. You can approach the novice appropriately for their level of understanding, and the expert with their level of understanding. And so virtue ethics understands that that's a difficulty as well. And with that complexity, they're allowing and trying to keep the theory adequately complex or adequately simplistic, depending on the level of an individual. And the ultimate goal for both the novice and the expert is moral education. And the goal of that moral education is to make us a better person. And a better person is a more virtuous person, is someone who is more courageous when courage is called for, or more temperate when temperance is called for. And they know and understand when to be courageous and when to be temperate and when not to. A virtue is a character trait. It's not merely a habit or a tendency to act in a certain ways. Habits don't define a person, rather character traits do. So it's a characteristic, it's a trait. Virtue, I'm not sure if I said that correctly. A virtue is a character trait. That is to say, it really just is part of the person. It's part of who they are. It's not an action that they perform or fail to perform, or choose not to perform, rather. But really, it's just part of them. It's not a decision. It's not a choice in the moment. Instead, it's a habit. It's a lifestyle. So you don't look at a person who is virtuous, or you don't look at a person and say, well, they're virtuous most of the time, and so I guess we can call them a virtuous person. Yeah, 40% of the time they're doing things they shouldn't, but 60% of the time they are. Therefore, they're virtuous because they're mostly virtuous, and so we'll kind of round up. That's not what it means to be a virtuous person. If you've ever known that individual, and think about it for a second, if you've known the person that you would say is virtuous, and I've known very few people that I thought were just really, truly virtuous. One that always comes to mind, almost first, his name was Eddie. I think that really just is who he is. He really just is a good, upstanding individual. And it's not a matter, obviously, it's a matter of skill and development, because he's definitely developed himself. But he really just is a good person. And it's as much a part of him as his fingers and his toes. It just seems to be who he is. It matches not just that Eddie would do these things, but that's who Eddie is. That's who he is. And so that's the ultimate goal, is to educate a person long enough that they really do become this type of person. And so imagine that you've got a face, you've got your face, and you've got a mask, and you want your mask to be more like, or you want your face to be more like this mask. And so when it comes to virtue, the idea here is that if you take that mask and you press it hard enough over your face, and you press it long enough on your face, that your features will kind of melt into the mask, and that when you take the mask off, your face will in fact look like the mask looked. And that's what you want with virtue ethics. If you want to become a morally virtuous person, you have to pretend often, because a lot of us, that's not the case. I know it's true for me. And I just have to kind of pretend to be that calm, decent individual in traffic, when what I want to do is drag them out of the car, pick up my car, and beat them to death with my car. And so instead, what I do is I pretend I'm that virtuous person who is going to behave appropriately, even though that's not what I feel like doing. I defy myself, and I smash that virtuous mask on my face, and then hopefully eventually, over time, when I take that mask back off, that really is who I'll be. I'll really be that person who looks like, virtuously, the thing that I wanted to look like. So it's not just a habit. It has to become something that you are. It really is something that you are. Now, you have to become that thing through habitually doing it, but eventually virtue should just be who you are. Yeah, okay. So Aristotle thought that it was obvious that all of us seek out what he called eudaimonia, and the word eudaimonia in Greek translates as happiness, or better, it translates as flourishing. Happiness for me in our culture is a little too flimsy. It's this kind of, our happiness seems to be more of a have a nice day, momentarily, Christmas morning magic happiness that is gone, by the time the lunch is ready on Christmas. That magical happiness that you have in those those few morning hours of Christmas, and then it's gone. Or I'm really happy that I'm enjoying, this sunset, and then it's gone. And so happiness, there translated happiness, I think is too light. It is too flimsy. The better translation really is flourishing. And what flourishing means is that it's a much bigger and broader and more encompassing concept. If something is flourishing, that means that it begins to be stronger and better and more able to perform, and it can do that over a period of time. And so happiness is momentary and fleeting. It goes away very quickly. But flourishing is a type of thriving that is lifelong and does not cease just because the sun sets or just because Christmas morning ends. Your flourishing will continue simply because because you're constantly developing and growing and getting stronger, and in this case wiser as well. Now, to kind of illustrate that a little bit, when I was working on my master's degree, there was a tree in an arboretum close to campus, and I was always looking for free stuff to do because I was really poor. And so we found this arboretum, and we'd walk around looking at the different trees and whatnot, and they had this tree from South America that had a fan set up, and the fan was blowing on the tree, and I'm looking at that, and because I'm always wanting to know why. And so I wanted to know why they had a fan blowing on this tree. So I sat and read the plaque, and basically what it was is that when the people who had the arboretum first planted the tree, that tree kept falling over, and it wouldn't stand up. So they tied it to a stake and tried to get it to grow up. And when they take the stake off, the tree would just flop over. It was really flimsy. The bark would never get hard. It just fell over all the time. And so the tree wouldn't flourish. And so finally, they tried multiple things. Finally, they called down to South America and asked one of the tree guys down there, why won't our tree, stand up and grow? And the guy said that particular tree, the bark on that tree needs wind in order for the bark to stiffen. And since they had it inside an enclosed area, the winds never hit the tree, so the tree's bark would never stiffen up because it didn't have anything to fight. It didn't have anything to struggle against. And so it would just go limp and fall over. So they took a fan and they put it on the tree. And when they did that, the bark stiffened up and the tree now would stand up and begin to flourish. And so flourishing has more to do with a long time exercising and determination and shooting for this and this and this, and has less to do with that moment of happiness because you're enjoying Christmas morning or a sunset that will change and go away later. And so it incorporates both the struggle and it incorporates the ability, like this tree, to draw nutrients and to draw sunlight and to draw water. And so it builds itself up like an athlete has to struggle against something in order to get stronger. The tree had to struggle in order to get stronger as well. And that's more of a picture of what flourishing is. Yes, life incorporates good stuff, but it also incorporates struggle, and that's what it means to flourish. And I think that's very important too when it comes to understanding what our founding forefathers said when they said we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't think they meant that we have the right to pursue, Merry Christmas morning happiness or have a nice day happiness or sunset enjoyment. That's not the kind of happiness they were talking about. I think they meant more like flourishing. We all have the right to go out and try to get the things and to struggle to get those things that make us stronger, and therefore in that struggle we get happier and more successful because we are working towards the things that we want, and that allows us to then flourish. So Aristotle thought it obvious that all of us seek eudaimonia. We all seek the good life. We all seek to flourish. That's what all of us want. So we're looking to flourish. Whatever that might mean for you, flourishing for you might mean, pursuing these goals, whereas flourishing for someone else might mean pursuing these goals. And so whatever it is that you're pursuing, we all pursue some kind of goal that allows us to that allows us to flourish. I was looking at the word happiness, and I got flurriness out of that. I'm not sure if flurriness is a word, and I'm actually quite certain that it's not. So anyway, we're all striving for the flourishing life, for eudaimonia. So Aristotle thought that a good life is going to be an active one, and it's one that's filled with wise choices and worthy pursuits. So again, your goal might be different, but you're making wise choices to try to get to those things that you think are worthy, so you're pursuing these things, and that is eudaimonia. He argued that virtue is an essential element in a good life. That is to say that that having a good life isn't necessarily the avoiding of calamity that there is within that good life, that flourishing. There are individuals who are virtuous that do in fact lose their entire families, or they fall prey to disease, or perhaps they land in some kind of disability or whatever it might be. So being a virtuous person doesn't necessarily always mean having that kind of happy life where your family's necessarily all gathered around you. You can lose family and still be that virtuous person. And he's juxtaposing that. He's putting that up against, say, for example, he's going to say that just because someone's got a life that is filled with wealth and prosperity, and they're always surrounded by I'm going to say the best of things, and so that they retire in lavish style, Aristotle's going to say that that individual is not necessarily virtuous. He's going to say that that's not necessarily the good life, that's not the best life, and that he's going to say that a person who is virtuous is going to be happier than a person who is not virtuous. Even if the virtuous person does fall prey to a tremendous disease or lose the entirety of their family or all of their money or any of those things, he's going to say that person is truly happy. That person is truly happy, whereas opposed to the person who is not virtuous, even if they retire with their family around them and they have good health and they have all the money that they could ever possibly spend, even that person, the non-virtuous person, he's going to say the virtuous person is always going to be happier than that person, because he says that that person who retired in lavishment, that the vicious individual, they can never really truly have enjoyed their lives because they're constantly performing actions that were not virtuous, and so that somehow they can't be happy because they're not doing what they were supposed to. They can't truly enjoy their money, and maybe they can't enjoy their money because since they were such a vicious person, they've surrounded themselves with vicious people, and they can never relax, and they can never trust, and they can never love, and they can never put themselves in a position where they can be vulnerable, whereas a person who is virtuous did trust, did love, could be vulnerable, and so maybe they don't have all this stuff, but maybe they're truly more happy than the person with all this stuff, but who did not foster relationships and instead went after things. And so he says there's this kind of disconnect. There's more to it than just the material stuff. And so one of the important questions when it comes to virtue ethics is how attractive is it? And I think this is kind of a good barometer, kind of a good measurement to see how useful is this, or how much might this help us, right? Because we're looking at all these different theories of all these different moral theories, and we're trying to figure out different ways that are helpful when it comes to making moral choices. And I think that the first two ways that we looked at, deontology and utilitarianism, very helpful. I think they bring to the table something that's very, very important for each and every one of us to think about. And so what is it that virtue ethics brings to the table? The idea of that, it's a skill. We need to have wisdom. It takes time and training. And that we should look to a person who is a virtuous example. Yes, we can follow rules. if there's not a rule that applies, what do we do next? What if they come into conflict? And so it's this kind of big dynamic that's out there, and it kind of surrounds us. And so with all the things that virtue ethics brings to the table, ultimately, how powerful is it? We're going to cover some weaknesses in just a moment, but I want you to kind of think about one of the important strengths of it. When it comes to deontology, and you're raising children, would you think of your child as being complete if all they ever did was do their duty? If they couldn't get beyond that deontological perspective of they do their duty? Or what if the child didn't get beyond understanding moral choices as being understood through bringing pleasure and pain? Don't we think that there's more to morality than just those two aspects? And with virtue, one of the strengths, one of the things I think it brings to us is that with virtue ethics, it might be something that I try to live towards, and that I would want to develop this skill, and I want myself to become these things. It's focused on the kind of person that I want to become. But I think even more pointedly, even more revealingly, is that for my children, this is the kind of person that I would want. These are the things I would want my children to focus on. That I would want them to focus on. What kind of person should I be? Not just what kind of actions should I do or not do, but what kind of person should I be? And I think that's really revealing, because we want the best for our children, and if we want the best for our children, and this is the kind of questions we want our children to ask, then that's a very powerful positive for thinking about virtue ethics and what it can give to us. And so, those aspects and those characteristics and those traits, all of them, hopefully, at least according to Aristotle, leading to a flourishing life. Your child is going to be a happier, better, more successful person if they worry about, and this is what Aristotle is saying, if they're worried about what kind of person they should be. How often do you get a job based on the fact of, and we want to work with these people, as opposed to, they always do these things right? Is it always just about doing the right thing, or is it sometimes wanting to have certain types of individuals around us? And that's going to be true in jobs. It's going to be true in family, friends. All of those things are going to be part of it. So that's one of the really powerful aspects of, is this something you'd want for your children? Some of the weaknesses for virtue ethics. The first one is the relativity of virtue. So an initial difficulty for virtue theory is that of identifying virtues. If there is an objective list of virtues, then it's difficult to overcome cultural prejudice in saying what goes on in it. Indeed, it might be plausible to be thought that virtues are culturally relative. What that means is that when it comes to just finding a person of virtue, like Aristotle talked about, sometimes that can be culturally influenced as to what you consider to be a virtue as opposed to what you consider to be a vice. And so it's not just the case that there is a set of virtues and vices out there, but rather that our cultures have played up some virtues as being very, very important, and more important than other virtues, or that some vices have been looked at as being more evil than other vices. And so there's not just this kind of thing where everything's just apples over here and bananas over here. There's kind of a cultural thing where one culture might say, it's this is the most important virtue, and another might say, no, it's this one. So for example, it would seem that the British have a taste for self-deprecation. That is to say, they tend to kind of downplay themselves and their abilities. And so that is seen as a virtue when it comes to the British cultural mindset. And so the American virtuous mindset is more of one of self-confidence and self-belief. Now, that's not to say the British don't believe in themselves. What that's to say is that how you display that kind of self-confidence is vastly different in a British culture versus in an American culture. And in a British culture, they can see Americans as being brash and overly self-confident and cocky, whereas the Americans can sometimes look at the British and see them as being falsely humble. And so false humility is actually seen as a vice in America. And if you really think you're that good, just go ahead and let people, just say, hey, this is who I am. I am this good. Whereas in the British culture, they're going to say that humility is going to be that overriding vice, and that Americans come across as too cocky, too self-confident, and that it's offensive and it's a vice. So which one is it? When it comes to the British and the Americans and their particular views on how one should display their self-confidence, because both cultures have individuals who are self-confident, but which way do you display your self-confidence? Which one is virtuous? Which one's the right way? And which one's the vicious way? Well, there's no real answer for that, because the cultures have developed in different ways. And so virtue ethics can't answer those kinds of questions, because it's purely a cultural phenomenon that, isn't necessarily answered through. You can't even just look to a virtuous person, because a virtuous person to an American is going to be, the cocky to the British, and the virtuous person to the British person is going to be falsely humble in the American's opinion. And so you can't even do that. So virtue ethics can't answer those kinds of questions. There is the weakness of application. That is to say that there is also the question of how to apply virtue theory to moral dilemmas. Virtue theory tells us to exhibit virtues, to act as virtuous persons would act. But if we don't already know how a virtuous person would act, how do you work that out? That is to say, one of the important aspects of virtue ethics is to look for a person who is virtuous, and then to emulate that person, to hold them up as an example. But if you don't already know what a virtuous person behaves like, how can you identify this person over here as a virtuous person? Now, if you already know how a virtuous person behaves, you don't need the virtuous example, because you already know how a virtuous person behaves, and so you don't need to go find the person, because you already have knowledge. But if you don't have knowledge of how a virtuous person behaves, how can you go find a virtuous person and pattern yourself after them? And so, it's kind of a which comes first, the moral exemplar or the moral knowledge. You have to have both. You have to have knowledge to find the example, but you have to have the example to find the knowledge. So which one comes first in virtue ethics? And there doesn't seem to be an answer for that particular issue within virtue ethics. Virtue theory, this is the third one. Virtue theory appears to commend some behavior that we generally view as immoral. For instance, soldiers fighting unjust wars for oppressive regimes, just say the Nazis, for example, they seem to exhibit courage. There were plenty of soldiers on the German side who were behaving courageously. They were fighting for a bad cause, but they were fighting virtuously, in the sense of that they were being courageous, and courage is a virtue. So what do we do with these people who have now, I'm going to say, because now with the Nazis, what do we do with these individuals who display virtue, who are virtuous, but in this case they're fighting for a cause that is tremendously vicious and tremendously evil? What do we do with those things? And so you can't say of someone that they're virtuous in some ways and at some times, and then on the other hand that they're not virtuous and not a virtuous person at others. There almost seems to be this idea of you have to be a virtuous person or not. And so let me do it this way. Imagine that you're talking about an individual who says that, you're talking about an individual, and of them you say they're a virtuous person. Yes, it's true, catch them on a Thursday between 10 and 11 and they'll be robbing banks, but catch them any other time and they're a virtuous person. Well, that seems kind of counterintuitive. Are they virtuous or aren't they? Kind of becomes the question and kind of becomes the problem. And so, what do we do with these individuals who display virtuous characteristics, but they're doing it for perhaps the wrong reasons? Can we say that they're virtuous? It becomes a difficult question to answer in this case. The fourth and final weakness for virtue ethics here is the one. It's called supererogation, and it's the word super, super, and then erogation, supererogation. And when you talk about someone who's behaving in a supererogatory manner, you're talking about someone who's behaving in a tremendously, an exceptionally good manner, right? So we would say, for example, saints behave in supererogatory ways, or heroes behave in supererogatory ways. And so you've got a firefighter who runs into a building in order to try to save someone, or save a pet, or save someone's photo album or something like that. They're behaving in a way that most of the rest of us are not going to behave. So they're running back into this burning house, and they're gathering something of tremendous importance to someone else, and at great personal risk. They have nothing involved. They're not running into their house trying to save their child or their pet or photo album. They're running into someone else's house who they have no connection with whatsoever, but they go in at great personal risk to themselves. They could stay outside, and they retrieve these things. We say that these types of activities are super erogatory. They go above and beyond what most people would do, and what's expected of most people. Most people are going to be standing around outside the house, watching it burn, and then this person does something that goes above and beyond the call of duty, right? It's something that the rest of us maybe don't do, and it's above and beyond. It's more than is considered what they should do. They're doing more than is required. And so, if you consider for a moment a very wealthy person who sells everything they have, and then they go off to a very poor nation, and they start trying to pass out this wealth, and so they start distributing the wealth. Aristotle, and in virtue ethics, you're going to look at that, and you're going to wonder at what point you can describe what they're doing as virtuous versus what they're doing as actually a vice. Because if they go out and distribute all of their wealth and they spread it out so much amongst all these other people, and then they themselves become poor, then that is excessive generosity. That a person they've gone too far. They shouldn't have given that much, in the sense of that now there's another poor person on the planet that we have to, then the rest of us have to try to begin to take care of. And so there is that kind of difference between the generosity versus the over generosity. Where is the line that is drawn so that we can know when a person is doing too much? And so within that virtue ethics, it becomes difficult to see where the lines are drawn. That much is not clear. That there is a line is definitely understood within virtue ethics, but where the line is precisely is not something that is drawn. You have to turn back to that moral wisdom, not just toward moral wisdom in this case, but also just toward wisdom in general, of where and when that individual has gone too far in the actions that they're performing. And it's a difficulty for virtue ethicists in the sense of that those lines are not necessarily distinct, and that sometimes it's a good thing for these wealthier individuals to do it, and then sometimes it's considered a vice, and so it's hard to see exactly where the lines are going to be drawn. And if they do this, not just that it's hard to tell where the lines are drawn, but if we have this individual, this wealthy Westerner, this really wealthy individual who leaves their particular culture and moves to another country and then sells everything and spreads it out, if they are a moral example to the rest of us, then shouldn't all the rest of us sell everything we have and go distribute it among the poor? After all, part of virtue ethics is finding a morally just individual and then emulating that individual. But are all of us required to sell all of our wealth and distribute it amongst the poor of the world? If we follow, if we say that this individual who did that is virtuous, even though it's a supererogatory action, if we say that they're virtuous, then shouldn't the rest of us then somehow follow suit because we've got this tremendously virtuous example who's doing it? So shouldn't the rest of us be doing it? And it would seem that there are times when we don't follow that example, but instead we have to to go a different route. We have to find a different venue, even though this example over here is showing us one thing. We've got an example over here that perhaps shows us another thing. How do we know when and where and which example to go with? And it can be a very, very difficult thing to do. Okay, so within virtue ethics, some good points, some bad points. I think one of the most important and key points for virtue ethics is definitely the word wisdom, that we're trying to figure out a way where we can take the very messy, the very ooey gooey, the very spaghetti humanity that we all have, and when we're thrown into these really, really difficult situations, that we have to find a way to track the very, very narrow path between morally right and morally wrong. Virtue ethics, I think, can help us pull from both the extremes, that deontological and utilitarianism, both those extremes that we get in. It'll pull from both of those and help us find their strengths, and perhaps give us the ability to try to use some judgment, use that experience, and use that wisdom that perhaps and hopefully we all kind of gain as we're moving forward in our lives. Certainly there are weaknesses within virtue ethics as well, but hopefully having studied all three, we can look at what all three of them have to offer. We can look at the weaknesses of all three of them, and perhaps through taking all of them together, we have thought about morality, how it can function, perhaps how it should function, how it can't function, how it shouldn't function, and perhaps through all of these things together, we can begin to understand a little bit about it and say, here's a little bit about how it works. There's so much more to it. Like I said, there's full courses on this that hopefully your university also offers. And if you're interested in it, then go take one of those courses where you can develop even more of your thinking when it comes to morality. So next time, I think we begin our introduction to religion. So our introduction on morality is way too short. Like I said, there's just not enough time in our course to do more than we've done. And so next time, introduction to religion.